Hi, I'm John Kursky. This is Atlas, and in this video, I want to show you how to do row-level security testing with PQL.Assert. All right, as always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date on all the new features and content we'll be putting out in the coming weeks. And with that, let's talk about testing with row-level security. Now, for myself and my teams, this is something that definitely would keep me up at night because we were always concerned that maybe a minor change to the model or an elevation of privileges in a workspace would inadvertently give folks access to more information than they were allowed to have. And we always struggle with how do we test for that? And often the way that we would do that is you'd have these kind of dummy accounts, or you would have folks for a short period of time play the role of that, let's say, East user or West user, and see what data they can and can't see. But we wanted to see if there's an automated way to do that. So I'd like to show you a technique with PQL.Assert that will allow you to run tests using specific users that have certain permissions for the model. Now, up on my screen here, I have the PQL.Assert v0.2.0. This is a version specifically tailored for at least the March 2026 release of Power BI Desktop, and allows us to access some additional information, which I want to walk through here, but it's going to give us the information we need in order to understand how do we run our tests against the model for specific RLS scenarios, or row-level security scenarios. And I'm going to show you a version of a model. I've got a very simple model here that is a set of groups. Those groups filter the fact, and I'm applying row-level security on the groups table so that it filters the group fact table. And in those tables, we have a very simple setup. Here's your groups. Here's the group facts. And the groups is East and West. Now, I have set up in the manage roles. Under groups for East, I'm just setting it, if you're part of East, it's going to filter that table. And if you're part of West, it's going to filter this table under West. Now, typically when I was working with this data or working with teams, you can change the role and view the role that way. And I can see if the data is there, but that requires a manual effort. Now, what we have been doing now that we have the ability to do user-defined functions is I've built a function that looks like this. So I've called it RLS. I want it to run in any environment. And specifically, I want to make sure that if you're part of the West security group, you can't see other groups. And I've got it where the expectation is 0 if I'm counting the rows for all the groups that aren't equal to West. So if I'm in the West group, and I filter on this and I'm looking for any of the groups that don't equal West, I should have 0 because I don't have access to these other groups. And so when I run this now, you'll see that that's false because I'm an administrator on this and I haven't applied any roles. I'm going to see the East group. Now, you can actually run a lot of these tests under a different scenario. So I can actually click View, click on West. Let me show you that again. I can click on View As, click on West, and then you can see here it's only showing the West data. Now if I go back to DAX Query View and I run this function, you'll see the test pass. That's because Power BI Desktop is nice enough to respect what role I'm running under and make sure that the test that when I execute it, runs it under that role. So that's quite nice. But how do we automate this so that if I want to run this against something like a Fabric Notebook, where I could run through all these RLS tests under the West group or even the East group and set the expectations in those tests that they don't see what they're not allowed to see? Well, let's walk through that real quickly. So one of the cool features that in the March release that they added was the ability for us to get annotations out of our user-defined functions. So if I was to go to the Tyndall view, I can actually open up a new tab, and on the right here, if I filter by the RLS test, I can script this tab out. Now, you'll notice that I've added an annotation here. I'm going to get rid of it real quick. So out of the box, it's going to look like this, where I just have the function with the lineage tag, but I can add in an annotation here and give it PQL.Assert underscore impersonated username and set it equal to a universal provider name or an email address that's in my tenant that I want to test it in. And in this case, I have Atlas. This account is going to just be assigned to the West group. And so I could run this test in the future using the Atlas account so that when I run this in Fabric, I can actually say, hey, when you run this user-defined function against the model and the service, use this account. And if there's annotations there, the new version of PQL.Assert will respect that and execute it using that user-defined function. So once I've added that, all I have to do is hit apply. And if I go back to DAX Query View, I want to show you a new function that was added. I can hit evaluate PQL.Assert retrieve tests v2. And you'll see there's a v2 for environment as well. The reason we have a distinguishing factor between the original and the v2 is the original ones will work in Power Automate because they're using functions that aren't prohibited by the underlying API in Power Automate. V2 requires the info functions to grab the annotation so that you can actually see what impersonated user needs to be. So we've separated the two so that way from a regression error standpoint, we're not impacting anyone using the Power Automate flows. All right, so if I retrieve the test now in v2 and I hit run, you'll notice now it will give us a test, the name, and also the impersonated user. So that's really important when we're trying to automate the testing, because if I run this in a Fabric notebook, I could point it at a service in the model, have it retrieve the test, and it will know whether or not it needs to use an impersonated user to execute that test. All right, so let's see this in the service. So let's assume I've published this in the service. What's the next thing I need to do? So if I do have this in the service, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the security area, click on security, and under West, you'll see I've added that account, the same account I want to run the test under, to the West group. That's important because those security settings need to be applied to the service. You also need to make sure that this account only has view rights to the workspace, because if you elevate its privileges above to contributor, or I believe member, even admin, they're going to see everything. It has to be view. RLS is really important that when you assign members, make sure that those members only have view rights to the workspace or the app so that the row level security is preserved. This is a good test for that though, because if you have that expectation that this user only is a part of West and shouldn't see other things, and somebody accidentally gives them admin rights or member rights to the workspace, the test will fail, and you'll know quickly that something's wrong in the configuration of your workspace. All right, so I've added it row level security, and I have, and I'll put a link in the YouTube video, a link to the Jupyter notebook, or the notebook, the Fabric notebook that you can download, and then you can import that. So if I go back to the workspace here, you can import from the computer once you download that file, and then you'll get this run PQL.Assert tests. And when you open that up, what it is going to do is use a library called Semantic Labs, which is a wonderful library that helps you work with semantic models in Python or PySpark. And it will install it. run the imports, set up the configuration. So this is really important here. You're going to need to identify the workspace that you want to run the tests on. You can make this multiple workspaces. I just have one identified here. When you import this the first time, you are going to have to update that. Make sure it's pointing to the workspace GUID. If you don't know what the workspace GUID is, you can always find it when you go to the semantic model or the report. It is the GUID that is after the groups. Now in this case, I'm running this in the same workspace I have the model. In other scenarios that I've implemented, that notebook sits in maybe a management workspace, but my models sit in another workspace. So the GUID might be different. I've also set the environment. In this case, I'm running it under any. For the notebooks, you can tell it whether or not you want it just to run the dev test, the prod test. I have it set for any at this point. If you're unfamiliar with that naming convention, you can check out episode 2 of the AI-enabled Power BI tester, which I'll put a link to the series at the end of this video so you can follow what the naming conventions are. Now in step 4, I've got a bunch of helper function that's going to call that retrieve test v2 and then run the evaluation. It'll execute the tests. If there's no impersonated user, it's just going to run the straight fabric evaluate DAX. If I need to run it as a user, then it will take advantage of Semantic Link Labs and evaluate with DAX impersonation. And then finally, it will iterate through all the workspaces, retrieve the tests, and at the bottom, you can see here that it has executed the test. It says that it's going to execute underneath using this user because that's an annotation that was in the model that I published. And ultimately, it will display the test results, including what workspace it was in, the workspace name, semantic model, what test it ran, the test name, whether it passed, and if there was an impersonated user. Now, what's nice about this is that you could take this a next step. You could ship this off to an event house. If you want to just highlight any failed test in your model, you could ship this up to the lakehouse to store this for analysis later. What's really nice about this is now you can run those tests, whether or not you want to run them just regular data quality tests or you want to do RLS testing in your with your semantic models. All right, so I hope you learned something today. What I showed you was how to set up tests using PQL.Assert using annotations, specifically identifying what user you want to run the test under. Now, I have links to the Jupyter Notebook in the YouTube description, and in future videos we'll dive a little more into advanced testing techniques. But until then, thank you for your time.